The Galactic Culinary Institute on Station Harmony 7 had trained chefs from 247 species over its three-century existence. It was the most prestigious cooking school in known space, where the finest culinary minds competed for a chance to study under Master Chef Vexilla, a Corthanian whose 12 tentacles could work 12 different preparations simultaneously and whose palate could detect flavor compounds measured in parts per trillion. When a human named Thomas Chen applied, the admissions board laughed. Humans were barely 50 years into galactic society. Their cuisine was considered primitive, excessive use of heat, crude flavor combinations, and over-reliance on what other species considered burning their ingredients. The idea that a human could compete with species who'd been refining their culinary arts for millennia was absurd. But Thomas had one thing going for him: a letter of recommendation from Ambassador Kira Thelvan, a Valorisian diplomat who'd eaten at Thomas's small restaurant on Earth and declared it the finest meal of her 400-year life. The board couldn't ignore such an endorsement from such a distinguished figure. So Thomas Chen became the first human ever admitted to the Galactic Culinary Institute, arriving on Harmony 7 with a single bag, a set of well-worn knives, and absolutely no idea what he was walking into. On his first day, Thomas discovered he was the only human in a class of 30 students from species ranging from the crystalline luminar to the gas-form ethereals who experienced taste through chemical absorption rather than traditional eating. He stood in the lecture hall, 5'9" and unremarkable among beings who ranged from 3 feet to 12 feet tall, some with tentacles, some with multiple heads, some who existed partially in dimensions he couldn't perceive. The other students stared at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt. "A human," said Crystal, a Thorian with 6 arms and scales that shifted colors with his emotions. His scales currently showed deep purple dismissive superiority. How quaint. "I suppose they'll teach you which end of a knife to hold." The class tittered. Thomas said nothing, just took his seat at the back and opened his data pad to review the day's lessons. Master Chef Vexilla entered the room, her tentacles flowing like water, her enormous eyes taking in the assembled students. "Welcome," she said, her voice translated through universal communicators, "to advanced culinary theory. You are here because someone believed you had potential. My job is to determine if they were right or tragically mistaken." She activated the room's holographic display showing complex molecular structures and flavor compounds. "Today we begin with the fundamental question every chef must answer. What is taste? Not the mechanical process of detection, but the experience, the art, the soul of cuisine." For the next 3 hours, she lectured on flavor theory, molecular gastronomy, and the psychology of eating across different species. Thomas took notes furiously, his mind racing to keep up with concepts he'd never encountered in his years of cooking on Earth. The first practical assignment came that afternoon: create a dish that demonstrates mastery of the 5 fundamental flavor profiles recognized across galactic cuisine: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami. They had 3 hours and access to ingredients from across known space. The other students rushed to the ingredient storage, grabbing exotic items: crystallized starlight from Luminar Prime, aged fermentation broths from the Krell homeworld, molecular flavor extractors that could isolate and amplify specific taste compounds. They worked with equipment that looked more like chemistry labs than kitchens: sonic synthesizers, molecular deconstructors, flavor printers that could create tastes that had never existed in nature. Thomas walked to the ingredient storage and stood there for 10 minutes just looking, overwhelmed, lost, Finally, he grabbed what he recognized, something that looked like rice, a protein that resembled chicken, vegetables he could identify, basic ingredients, familiar territory. While the other students created elaborate constructions involving 17 ingredients and 12 different cooking techniques, Thomas made fried rice. The judgment was brutal. Pedestrian declared Crystal, who'd created an elaborate tower of crystallized flavors that shifted between all 5 profiles with each bite. Unsophisticated, added Sella, a luminar whose dish literally glowed with flavor intensity. Even Master Vexilla seemed disappointed. Student Chen, she said, her tentacles drooping slightly. You have demonstrated competent knife skills and adequate heat control, but this is the Galactic Culinary Institute. We do not train cooks. We train artists. I see no art here. Thomas nodded, accepting the criticism without argument. He cleaned his station, packed his knives, and returned to his small quarters on the station. That night, sitting alone, he almost quit, almost booked transport back to Earth, back to his small restaurant where people appreciated his food, where he understood the ingredients and the customers and what he was trying to achieve. But then he remembered why he'd come. Not to prove humans could compete with other species in their cuisine, but to learn, to grow, to push himself beyond what he already knew. He spent the night researching. Every species represented in his class, their biology, their homeworlds, their cultural relationships with food. He discovered that Thorians had sensory organs that detected temperature variations across their scales, making them exquisitely sensitive to thermal layering in dishes. Luminars experienced flavor as light frequency shifts, which was why their cuisine glowed. Ethereals absorbed chemical compounds directly, experiencing taste as complex molecular dances. Over the following weeks, Thomas remained quiet. While other students competed vocally, boasting about their techniques and criticizing each other's work, Thomas watched, listened, learned. He studied how Crystal used his 6 arms to maintain 3 different temperature zones simultaneously, creating dishes with thermal complexity Thomas had never imagined. He observed how Sella manipulated light-reactive compounds to create visual flavor harmonies. He learned from an ethereal named Whisper, who communicated through translated chemical releases, how scent and taste were fundamentally related across all species, just expressed differently. And slowly, quietly, Thomas began to understand something the other students missed. They were all cooking for approval, for grades, for status. They'd forgotten the fundamental purpose of food. His breakthrough came during the midterm examination. The challenge: create a dish that comforts, not impresses, not amazes, comforts. Master Vexilla explained that comfort food existed across all cultures, all species, serving a psychological purpose beyond mere nutrition. The other students created elaborate dishes based on their homeworld specialties, technically perfect but somehow missing something essential. Al made a Thorian delicacy involving precisely calibrated temperature layers that would remind any Thorian of childhood. Sella crafted a light frequency pattern that mimicked luminar sunset ceremonies. Thomas made soup, simple miso soup, but he'd spent days researching each ingredient. The kelp came from an aquatic farm that specialized in growing earth seaweeds in alien oceans, maintaining the exact mineral composition of Japanese coastal waters. The miso paste he'd fermented himself over 3 weeks, using techniques he'd learned from his grandmother. The tofu was fresh, silken, perfect. The green onions were sliced with a precision that would have made his old sushi master weep. When he presented his bowl to Master Vexilla, she looked at it skeptically. "It's soup, Student Chen." "Yes, master." She dipped one tentacle into the broth, her chemical receptors analyzing the composition. Her eyes widened slightly. She dipped another tentacle, then another, until all 12 were in the bowl, each one trembling slightly. The room went silent. "What is this?" Vexilla whispered. "Comfort," Thomas replied quietly. "At least my version of it, the taste of home, the feeling of safety, the memory of someone who loved you enough to make you soup when you were sick." Vexilla was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I am Corthanian. I have never been to Earth. I have never experienced human childhood or human love or human soup-making traditions, yet somehow inexplicably this makes me feel safe, cared for, as if someone is telling me everything will be all right." She looked at Thomas with new eyes. "How did you do this?" "I stopped trying to cook like everyone else," Thomas said. "I started cooking what I knew, what I felt." The other students are technically better than me, they have skills I may never match, but I have something else. I have the memory of my grandmother making me soup when I had the flu, my mother's fried rice after a bad day at school, my father teaching me to fold dumplings while telling me stories about his childhood. I can't recreate fancy alien techniques, but I can recreate feeling, and feeling translates across species. From that moment, everything changed. Thomas stopped trying to compete with the technical mastery of his classmates and focused on what made his cooking unique: the emotional resonance, the sense of care and intention baked into every dish. He made congee for Whisper when the ethereal seemed stressed, adding herbs that complemented their chemical composition and somehow conveyed warmth without temperature. He taught Crystal how to make scrambled eggs, demonstrating that sometimes the simplest technique executed with care created more satisfaction than the most complex preparation. He showed Sella how caramelization, that primitive burning humans were mocked for, could create flavors of such depth and complexity that even her sophisticated palate was amazed. The other students began seeking him out, not for technical instruction, but for something else. They'd come to his station stressed from competition, exhausted from pressure, and he'd make them something simple: tea and rice crackers, fresh bread with butter, handmade noodles in clear broth, nothing fancy. Nothing that would impress Master Vexilla in a formal examination, but it made them feel better. Crystal, the Thorian who'd mocked Thomas on the first day, appeared at his door one evening looking miserable. His scales were gray, the Thorian expression of deep sadness. "My mother died," he said quietly. "I just received word. She was everything to me." Thomas said nothing. He gestured for Crystal to sit, then began cooking. He made a simple stir-fry with vegetables and protein, letting the ingredients speak for themselves rather than overwhelming them with technique. He brewed tea with careful attention to temperature and steeping time. He presented the meal without fanfare, just setting it in front of the grieving student. Crystal ate in silence, tears sliding down his scales. When he finished, he looked at Thomas. "This didn't make me forget, it didn't fix anything." "No," Thomas agreed, "it wasn't supposed to, but it made me feel like someone cared, like I wasn't alone." Crystal's scales shifted to soft blue gratitude. "Thank you," word spread. Thomas became known not as the primitive human who couldn't compete technically, but as someone whose food carried something the others couldn't replicate: genuine care. The students would seek him out not just when they were sad, but when they wanted to celebrate, to share joy, to mark important moments. He cooked birthday meals for species whose birthday traditions he had to research. He created celebration feasts for cultural holidays from worlds he'd never visited. He made comfort food for homesick students thousands of light years from home, somehow capturing in his simple dishes the essence of care that transcended species and culture. The final examination was the most challenging. Create a meal for Master Vexilla herself that demonstrates everything learned at the Institute. A single dish that showcased technical skill, artistic vision, cultural understanding, and personal growth. The other students created masterpieces. Crystal made a dish involving 17 different temperature zones and 36 ingredients from across the galaxy. Sella created a light-frequency symphony that was as much performance art as food. Whisper crafted molecular structures of such complexity that they existed partially in other dimensions. Thomas made dumplings. He spent 3 days on the filling pork and cabbage, but he'd researched Corthanian physiology and added compounds their species found particularly satisfying. The wrappers he rolled by hand, each one exactly the same thickness, pleated with precision that showed every hour he'd spent practicing. The dipping sauce balanced all 5 fundamental flavors while adding 3 more that Corthanian palates could detect but humans couldn't. But the real secret was in how he cooked them. He didn't boil or steam or fry. He did all 3 in stages, creating different textures and temperatures in different parts of each dumpling. It was a technique no one had seen before, born from understanding both human cooking methods and Thorian thermal sensitivity. When Master Vexilla tasted the first dumpling, her tentacles froze. She ate another, then another. She finished all 12 dumplings in silence, then sat back, her eyes glistening with what Thomas recognized as the Corthanian equivalent of tears. "Student Chen," she said finally, "when you arrived at this institute, I thought you would fail within weeks. You lacked the technical sophistication of your peers. You used primitive methods. You made soup when others made art." Thomas nodded, accepting this. "But you have taught me something I had forgotten in my centuries of culinary mastery." Vexilla gestured at the empty plate. "Cooking is not about impressing, it is about connecting. These dumplings are technically imperfect. I can identify 14 flaws in their construction, but they are emotionally flawless. You made me feel understood, cared for. You took the time to learn what my species values, then created something that honored both your tradition and mine." She stood, her full height imposing. "You pass. With highest honors, not because you are the most skilled technician, you are not, but because you understand what cooking is truly for, and that is rarer and more valuable than technique." Thomas graduated 3 months later. He didn't take a position at a prestigious restaurant or open an elaborate fusion establishment. Instead, he opened a small restaurant on Harmony 7 called Chen's Kitchen, where he cooked simple, honest food for anyone who needed it. The restaurant became famous, but not for the reasons other galactic establishments were famous. It wasn't listed in culinary guides as having the most innovative techniques or the rarest ingredients. It was famous because students from the institute would bring their families there, because diplomats would meet there for delicate negotiations, finding common ground over dumplings and tea, because people of hundreds of species would line up for hours just to eat something that made them feel cared for. Master Vexilla became a regular customer, always ordering dumplings, always leaving notes of feedback that Thomas would carefully consider and mostly ignore. She understood that what made his food special wasn't technical perfection, it was intention, care, love expressed through ingredients and heat and time. One evening, 5 years after Thomas's graduation, Crystal visited the restaurant with his new family, a bonded partner and 2 young offspring. His scales glowed warm gold as he introduced them to Thomas. "My children wanted to meet you," Crystal explained. "I've told them about the human who taught me that cooking isn't about competition or status. It's about making people feel less alone." Thomas smiled, his characteristic silence comfortable between them. He cooked for Crystal's family simple food made with care, served with genuine warmth. The young Thorians ate with enthusiasm, their scales brightening with pleasure. As they left, Crystal paused at the door. "You never talk much, do you? In 3 years at the Institute, I don't think I ever heard you say more than a dozen words at a time." "I prefer to let my cooking speak," Thomas replied quietly. "It speaks volumes," Crystal said, his scales shifting to deep blue, the Thorian expression of profound respect. "It speaks more eloquently than most of us ever manage with words." Thomas Chen never became a celebrity chef. He never opened chains of restaurants or appeared on galactic cooking shows. He stayed in his small establishment on Harmony 7, cooking simple, honest food for anyone who walked through his door. But he changed galactic cuisine forever. Other chefs began studying his approach, not his techniques, which remained relatively simple, but his philosophy. The understanding that cooking was ultimately about connection, about care, about making people feel less alone in an enormous galaxy. He was the silent human who won hearts not through speeches or showmanship, but through the universal language of food made with genuine intention. And in doing so, he taught the galaxy that sometimes the most profound messages are conveyed not through words, but through the simple act of feeding someone with care. His dumplings became legendary. His soup was studied in culinary schools. His tea service was analyzed by anthropologists as an example of cross-cultural communication through cuisine. But Thomas remained what he'd always been, a cook who understood that the highest purpose of food wasn't to impress or intimidate or showcase technical mastery. It was to make people feel cared for, understood, and connected to something larger than themselves. That was a lesson worth more than any diploma or award. That was cooking that truly mattered.